Picture this. It's a regular Tuesday morning. People are getting dressed, making coffee, arguing about what to have for breakfast. Kids are walking to school. Store owners are unlocking their doors. The city is doing what cities do, just existing, just breathing. And then, nothing. Not an explosion, not a flood, not a fire spreading through the streets, just silence. The phones stop ringing. The warnings that were supposed to come don't. The people who were supposed to act don't. And by the time anyone says a single word out loud about what's actually happening, it's already too late for thousands of people who had no idea they were in danger. This is the story of Bhopal, India, December 3rd, 1984. The night a gas cloud crept through a sleeping city and killed thousands of people, not just because of a chemical leak, but because of a silence that was years in the making. Bhopal, in 1984, was a city of about 900,000 people, capital of Madhya Pradesh, one of India's larger states. It had a lake in the middle of it, old mosques, narrow markets, and the kind of dense, layered neighborhoods where everyone knew their neighbors by face, if not by name. In 1969, Union Carbide, one of America's largest industrial corporations, set up a pesticide plant on the northern edge of the city. The plant made Sevin, a pesticide used across Indian farms to protect crops from insects. At the time, it felt like progress. India was trying to feed a growing population, and modern agriculture needed modern chemistry. The plant employed around 10,000 workers at its peak. It had a Union Carbide logo on its water tower. It was visible from parts of the city. People knew it was there. What they didn't know, what most of them never thought to ask, was what exactly was being stored inside it. The plant used a chemical called methyl isocyanate, MIK. It's one of the most toxic industrial substances ever used in large-scale manufacturing. Exposure to even small quantities causes violent reactions in the human body. Lungs, eyes, nervous system. In large quantities, it kills quickly. Union Carbide knew this. Their own internal documents acknowledged the danger. The question was never whether MIC was dangerous. The question was whether anyone treated that danger seriously once the business started struggling. By the early 1980s, the Bhopal plant was losing money. Indian farmers weren't buying as much Sevin as projected. The plant cut back production, then cut back staff. Safety systems that were already minimally designed started getting even less attention. Equipment broke down. Workers flagged problems and were told to manage with what they had. There's a memo. It's been cited in court documents and journalistic investigations for decades, from a Union Carbide engineer who visited the plant in 1982. He flagged serious safety concerns, leaking valves, undertrained workers, malfunctioning systems. The memo was noted, nothing changed. In the years before 1984, the Bhopal plant had small leaks. Workers got sick. Some died. The exact numbers were disputed and largely suppressed. A local journalist named Rajkumar Keswani wrote pieces warning that the plant was a disaster waiting to happen. He published them. He argued publicly that something terrible was being ignored. Nobody in power paid attention. The workers who raised internal concerns were sometimes reassigned, and the safety systems, including the refrigeration units that were supposed to keep MIC tanks cold and stable, were turned off to save money. A scrubber system that was supposed to neutralize any leaking gas was offline. A flare tower that could burn off escaping chemicals was out of service. 3 of the main backup systems were non-functional at the same time. But here's the thing that makes this worse. The plant wasn't operating secretly. It was right there. Government inspectors had visited. The local administration knew there was a hazardous facility. There was no proper emergency plan for the neighborhoods nearby. No evacuation protocol, no public awareness about what to do if something went wrong. The people living closest to the plant, in settlements like Jai Prakash Nagar and Kazi Camp, were mostly poor. Migrant workers, day laborers, families who'd built small homes as close to the plant as possible because the land was cheap. They had no idea what was stored a few hundred meters from where they slept. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, water entered Tank 610, which held around 42 tons of liquid MIC. How the water got in is still debated. Sabotage, negligence, or a routine cleaning procedure gone wrong. But water and MIC react violently. The tank began heating up. Pressure built. Workers noticed something was wrong around 11 p.m. There was a smell. Eyes were burning. Supervisors were told. What happened next is the part that doesn't fit into any rational framework. The response was slow. There was confusion about whose job it was to act. Warnings that should have triggered alarms were delayed, and when the tank finally vented, when 40 tons of MIC and other toxic compounds erupted into the air around 1 a.m., the city's alarm system either didn't activate or activated too briefly to matter. People woke up thinking they were having a nightmare. Here's what I want you to understand about what happened next, because this is where the story stops being just a story about chemicals and becomes something harder to look at directly. The gas didn't discriminate. It moved low to the ground because MIC is heavier than air. It followed the natural slope of the land, pooling in the lowest streets, seeping under doors, filling homes while people were asleep. Children were especially vulnerable. Their lungs were smaller. They inhaled proportionally more. And the city's hospitals, which were overwhelmed within hours, had no information about what chemical people had been exposed to. Union Carbide initially refused to provide clear data about the composition of the gas or the correct medical treatment. Doctors were treating patients without knowing what they were fighting. That silence, the silence of a corporation protecting information while people were dying, is the part that still doesn't have a clean answer. By early morning on December 3rd, the streets around the plant looked like something that hadn't happened in modern times. Bodies in the roads, people who had run and collapsed mid-step, animals, cows, dogs, birds, dead in piles. Thousands of survivors stumbling through the streets, eyes burning, unable to breathe, unable to see. The hospitals were flooded with patients so fast that doctors were triaging on the ground outside. Somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 people died in the first 72 hours. The estimates vary because the Indian government's record-keeping in the affected areas was incomplete, because many bodies were cremated quickly, and because Union Carbide spent years contesting the numbers. The Indian Council of Medical Research estimated that roughly 25,000 people died prematurely in the years following the disaster, from respiratory failure, cancers, and organ damage caused by the exposure. More than 500,000 people were exposed to the gas that night. Syed Abbas was 22 years old and lived near the plant. He woke up at 1 a.m. to his mother screaming. His younger siblings were unconscious. He carried 2 of them toward the hospital, a few kilometers through streets he could barely see, with lungs that felt like they were being scraped from the inside. He survived. His youngest brother didn't. Thousands of stories like his exist in the oral history of Bhopal. People who made impossible choices in the dark, mothers who grabbed the wrong child in the confusion, men who ran back into their homes to get family members and never came out. The survivors who lived with chronic illness, damaged lungs, failing kidneys, neurological problems, were often dismissed in the years that followed. Compensation was fought over in courts for more than 2 decades. Many of the people most affected were illiterate, living in poverty, with no ability to navigate a legal system that processed their lives as line items. By dawn on December 3rd, Bhopal was unrecognizable. The streets closest to the plant were quiet in a way streets aren't supposed to be quiet. Indian Army units arrived to help with the dead. Mass burials began because there were too many bodies for individual funerals. The lake in the center of the city turned reddish, contaminated by runoff from the disaster area. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide, flew to India and was briefly arrested before being released on bail. He then flew home to the United States and never returned to India. An Indian court eventually found him guilty in absentia. He died in 2014, having never faced trial. Union Carbide agreed to pay $470 million in a settlement with the Indian government in 1989. For reference, Union Carbide's annual revenues were in the billions. The settlement worked out to roughly $550 per victim. The plant site was never fully cleaned up. It still sits there. Bhopal changed industrial regulation in ways that are still felt today. In the United States, Congress passed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in 1986, directly in response to the disaster. It required companies to publicly disclose what chemicals they were storing and in what quantities. It created local emergency planning committees. It gave communities the legal right to know what was sitting in a plant 2 miles from their school. That law exists because Bhopal proved that the alternative, trusting corporations to self-regulate around life-threatening materials, produced a body count. In India, environmental and industrial safety law was strengthened in the years following 1984, but enforcement has remained inconsistent, and the legal aftermath of Bhopal has been used by scholars as a case study in how corporations can use jurisdictional complexity to limit liability across borders. The broader consequence is this: Bhopal demonstrated what happens when profit, regulatory capture, and institutional silence intersect in an industrial context. It wasn't a freak accident. It was the logical result of a series of decisions that were made, documented, and ignored at every level. There are currently thousands of chemical facilities operating near densely populated areas around the world, some in countries with strong regulatory frameworks, many in places where enforcement is thin, where communities have little political power, and where the people living nearest to these facilities are the ones who can least afford to fight back when something goes wrong. The pattern that produced Bhopal, a corporation cutting safety costs, a government failing to enforce its own standards, communities without information or recourse, isn't historical. It's ongoing. You can map it onto petrochemical plants along the Gulf Coast, onto mining operations in Central Africa, onto textile factories in South Asia. The specific chemical changes, the structure doesn't. And the digital version of this problem is worth thinking about too. We are increasingly dependent on systems, infrastructure, platforms, supply chains. where we have no visibility into what's actually being done with our safety, our data, or our environment. The silence that killed Bhopal was partly a silence of information. People didn't know what they were living next to. What are we living next to right now that we don't know to ask about? First, silence is not neutral. When warnings are ignored, whether by corporations, governments, or individuals, that silence is itself a decision with consequences. The engineers who wrote memos that went nowhere were not absolved by having written the memo. Second, proximity to power shapes safety. The people who died in Bhopal lived closest to the plant because they were the poorest residents of the city. Industrial risk in most countries falls disproportionately on communities with the least ability to resist it. That's not incidental, it's structural. Third, corporate accountability across borders remains largely unresolved. Warren Anderson never faced trial. The plant site was never cleaned. The compensation was inadequate. 40 years later, the legal mechanisms for holding a multinational corporation responsible for mass casualties in another country are still weak. Fourth, the right to know is a safety issue. Emergency planning and community. Right to know laws exist because of Bhopal. The argument that companies deserve privacy around hazardous materials stored in populated areas was tested against a real body count and lost. There's a photograph taken in Bhopal in the days after the disaster. A man is burying a child, his daughter from what investigators later pieced together. He's not crying in the photograph. He looks like he's run out of things to feel. That image stayed with people for 40 years. Not because it's dramatic, because it's quiet. Bhopal didn't end with a bang. It ended with fog and silence and a city trying to understand what had just been done to it. The lesson it left behind isn't complicated. What we choose not to say, not to fix, and not to ask about rarely stays quiet forever. It just waits. And one night, while everyone's asleep, it moves.